Good evening, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm,
Recording in progress.
a very warm welcome to all the participants in our insightful webinar on the overview of forensic accounting and investigation standards. Today, we are privileged to have a distinguished panel of speakers with us. Please join me in welcoming our Honorable Chairman, Mr. Charanjot Singh Nanda, Ms. Vice Chairman, Mr. Dayanivas Sharma, and our esteemed speakers, Mr. Sailesh Kaushik and Ms. Sashna Khanna. Before we dive into the enriching sessions ahead, it's an honor for me to introduce our Honorable Chairman, Mr. Charanjot Singh Nanda, the Central Vice Council Member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. He currently serves as the Chairman of Digital Accounting and Assurance Board, Committee on Financial Markets and Investors Protection, Committee on Information Technology of South Asian Federation of Accountants, and he's also the Vice Chairman of Board of Internal Audit and Management Accounting at ICI. In past, Mr. Nanda has chaired numerous pivotal committees of ICI. In addition to his notable contributions within India, Mr. Nanda has represented the profession on international platforms as well, presenting on critical topics such as IFRS, forensic accounting, and effective communication. Welcome, Mr. Nanda. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Akanksha. Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I can see Mr. Sailesh Kaushik, one of the luminaries in the profession, who has contributed a lot in framing of the forensic standards and framing the implementation guide. The other learned speaker of the day, Madam Ashna Khanna, the moderator, say Akanksha Kataria, officers from Digital Accounting and Insurance Board, technical support, Manish, and all the participants who have come here to go home more enlightened. I am truly honored to be amongst you, ladies and gentlemen. And let me tell you, your board, Digital Accounting and Assurance Board, is one of the most happening boards prevalent in the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India,
everyone.
which was set up an Act of Parliament way back on 1st July 1949, when the most important document to the democracy, the Constitution, was not adopted. The pertinent question that arises is, what prompted the Constituent Assembly to set up an Institute of Chartered Accountants of India when its own democratic setup is not in place? The answer is very candid, very simple, very forthcoming. They were looking for a disciplined band of soldiers to steer this country out of confusion. And there we are, the financial soldiers of the Indian capital. Ladies and gentlemen, today's topic, which would encompass series of informations on overview of forensic accounting and investigation standards. You'll be happy to know that 1st July 2023, first time in the globe we have made not only the forensic standards, but made them compulsory for all chartered accountants tendering reports after 1st July. Not only that, we had engaged close to 170 chartered accountants from various walks of life who created the draft implementation guide, which then went to the monitoring committee and then to the high-level committee. And after the high-level committee, it was released for public exposure, not only to the stakeholders or clients, but to regulators and government as well. All the comments that were received were incorporated, and thereafter, 3 legal vetting of the document was done. And on 1st July 2023, it was released for the public. Now you have 2 sets of documents. The first, you have the forensic standards, 23 forensic standards. And second, you have an implementation guide individually outlining how you could implement each and every standard. And the best part is that you have the hard copy, but the soft copy of both the publications is available at the website of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, and you can download it from there and use it for your professional perspectives. These standards have ultimately changed the way world looks at us. I'm reminded of a couplet which I occasionally say when I speak of the standards. The couplet says, "Dete na the jo jawab, unke salam aane lage. Dete na the jo jawab, unke salam aane lage. Waqt badla, to mere neem ke ped par aam aane lage." Ladies and gentlemen, we have a bumper crop of Alfonso mangoes, and we are harvesting it and consuming it. The profession now is at the top notch, and therefore we thought it fit that we should have series of programs on overview of forensic standards so that essentially people could understand them and assimilate them for their professional endeavors. I will not stand between you and the two London speakers, Shri Shailesh Kaushik and Madam Ashna Khanna. And therefore, I give the dance back to Madam Akanksha Kataria, the moderator of the day. Akanksha, the dance is all yours. You can take the things forward. And my apologies that I couldn't come on the camera because there is some technical glitch and there is some bandwidth issue. Over to Akanksha for further proceedings.
Thank you, sir. We have our eminent speakers, Shailesh Kaushik, with us. He's a professional with over 15 years in the petroleum industry, about 10 years in the IT consulting, and the last few years in accounting and audit practice. He's a chartered accountant by qualification and is also a certified information systems auditor. His key skills include coaching and mentoring, business process analysis, change management, and control reviews and investigation. He's comfortable working in multicultural environments and has managed global ERP implementation projects for Fortune 50 clients and has traveled to Europe, Africa, Asia, and America and handled portfolios as diverse as program management, risk assessment, change management, governance, and control reviews. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, but screen sharing is not permitted. So can you please permit that?
I request the technical team to do the same.
Technical team, please make Mr. Kaushik and Madam Khanna, Ashna Khanna as the host so that they're able to effectively share the screen.
Okay, thank you. Screen is visible.
Yes, sir, very much. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much, Akanksha ji, for those kind words of introduction. And thank you, Chairman Saab, for your wonderful words. And you never failed to include one of my favorite shairis in the end. So thank you so much. So
always there, Kaushik Saab, always there. For a wonderful person like you, always there.
So, like Nandaji said, this three major features of this, that we are the first institute to come up with a comprehensive set of standards. When I do go around with this, I do hear that the Canadian Institute has a standard, the Australian Institute does, the CPA has one. But these are one standard. I don't think anyone has come up with as comprehensive a one as the DAB and the ICAI, covering almost every aspect of forensic accounting and investigation. And to add to that, last year, and we released them in July this year, we've also brought in an implementation guide to help you understand and implement the standards, since they are now mandatory for all forensic assignments effective 1st of July. So we'll do an overview, and the overview consists of, I will talk you through the objectives, the preface and the framework. We also have some basic principles which we will cover. And Nandaji referred to 23 forensic standards. They are classified into different series. I will come to that shortly. They're about understanding the engagement. They're about accepting the engagement. They're about executing the engagement. Then we have special assignments. We have reporting, and we have quality. Ashna Madam will take you through from standard 300, which is execution. And I will cover the introduction and up to the 200 series of standards. Any of you with any questions, I think there's an option where you can put it to the moderator and they will transfer the questions to us and we will try to answer them as best as possible. As Nandaji said, the standards and the implementation guides are available for download. If you go to the Institute site and come to committees and then come to DAB, you will find the standards under publication and you will find the implementation guide there as well. If you have any difficulty in downloading or locating them in the site, please write to the DAB email and I'm sure they will help you with the link to download the standards. So, why did we, like we said, we are the first to come up with these comprehensive set of standards. So this slide basically covers why we thought it was necessary. One is, I have been doing this kind of assignments for some years now. And one of the things we used to hear all the time was that every forensic assignment is different. There can't be rules for forensic assignments. Some are in one industry, some are in the other. And there was a general tendency that each assignment followed a route of its own. So we thought the first part is there should be best practices. Expectations of stakeholders should be managed. We should have a common framework of terminology which we use. And so that we can understand how an assignment is to be performed. And while we do appreciate there are differences, the key is that a common methodology and approach helps both us as practitioners as well as the stakeholders who give us the assignment so that they understand what to expect at the end of the assignment. They also help harmonize and improve performance. And the guidance and knowledge is coming largely through the implementation guides. And the ICI brand per se has a wonderful name in all other spheres. This is a fairly new field. So we'd like a certain standard and a format and a quality coming out of each assignment report, which improves the ICI brand, and in turn, it improves our individual brands. Because collectively, what we do and how we are finally makes the ICI brand. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to go to the field with these standards, implement them, enhance ours and the Institute's reputation. The Institute also conducts the FAFD course, which covers all these aspects in some detail. And the implementation guides and others are available if you have any difficulty. And I'll try to summarize the expectations and each of the standards as we go along. So we've divided the standards, like we said, into multiple areas. The first is the introductory documents, which I'll cover shortly, which is the preface, the framework, and what the basic principles are. Then we come into the concepts in terms of if you are getting into a forensic investigation, what's the basics we should be aware of? First is what type of assignment are we doing? What risk does it entail? What are the kinds of regulations and laws we should be aware of? And then I will introduce what we call the hypothesis methodology of dealing with investigations. Next part, which we will deal with, is how do you manage an engagement? What are the objectives? What do we consider before we actually accept an appointment? Can we, like we do in regular assignments for audit, use the work of experts? We're dealing with fraud. When you talk of fraud, automatically there is either a current or a future involvement of agencies like the CBI, EOW, and other agencies. So if we're working with an agency, does it affect our protocols? What are we supposed to do? And how does it change the way we work? And 250 deals with establishing a communication protocol with the stakeholders, identifying who they are, identifying what needs to be communicated. This is where I will hand over to Ashna madam. She will cover the execution of assignments, which includes planning, collection of evidence and documentation, work procedures, interviews, reviews and supervision, testifying before authorities. Testifying before authorities, again, is a fairly specialized area. And I will do that. I will cover that slightly when we talk about the nature of assignments, and will be covered more in detail when she covers 360. Then there are special areas, data analysis, gathering evidence in a digital domain, loans and borrowings. And there's one standard which is under process. In forensics, we have an area, in regular parlance, we have what we call related parties. A fairly clear definition of what constitutes a related party. But to circumvent that, in a lot of fraud investigations, it has come to light that the companies do interact with entities which do not strictly fall within the related party definition, but their employees, a different kind of dependent, maybe lower grade employees given a large number of shares in a sister company, distant relatives involved in sister companies or other companies, and where it effectively means that the control is still with the company under investigation. So that's an area where a standard is still pending. Then there's the 500 series, which talks about how do we report. So that, and then there is a quality standard. Now, like we said, the overarching documents are primarily three. We will start with the preface, which introduces the standards and covers how the standards were made. Then there's the framework to bring a commonality between different kinds of assignment. We've established a structure for the FAIS, tried to come to a common terminology ground, and formatted it into particularly differentiated 6 sections. And then we're talking about the basic principles. We'll come to those. Let's start with the preface. Now, the first thing is the standards aren't case-based. They are more related to the outcomes we want to accomplish and talk in terms of the basic principles. Second thing is the standard tells for each area what is expected of you in terms of delivery of your work. The standards are not focused on how to do it. Like Nandaji said in his introductory remarks, we've also come out with an implementation guide for each standard, which covers how the standard is best implemented. Now, when we look at the standards per se, we say that they are applicable to all members and all FA, forensic accounting and investigation engagement. If there is any limitation in the applicability of a standard, it is covered in the standard itself. Now, the reason for this qualifier is traditionally, unlike, for example, a statutory audit, anyone today can conduct a forensic accounting or an investigation assignment. They can be experts in IT, they can be accounting experts who aren't in practice, they can be investigators, they can be data analysts, they can be business process experts. Now, as an institute, we can't mandate the standards for these categories of people. But the stand is that once we go to the market and publish these and they gain wider acceptance within the chartered accountant community where it's already mandatory, the expectation is the governments or regulators may also adopt them so that there is a similar standard adopted across. But that's a wider and larger expectation. As far as we are concerned from the institute, it's mandatory on members. The methodology for setting standards, Nandaji again covered this to a large extent. We did have, like, we involved more than 170 odd people in drafting. We had a study group which reviewed the drafts, sent them back for rework multiple times, and then the study group approves the standards. The study group then approves that they be taken to the Digital Accounting and Assurance Board, where multiple reviews are done. Once they get approved from the digital DAB, they go as exposure drafts to the general community. The general community is given the opportunity to offer clarifications, offer suggestions. Each of these suggestions or each of the comments, notes availed from the public are compiled by the DAB team, put back to the study group. The study group reviews each and every one of them and decides on the action to be taken, whether it's covered somewhere else, whether it merits a change in the standard, whether it merits a change in the language. And the exposure drafts also go to some government agencies. And in fact, we did get comments from quite a few of the government agencies, which shows that it's quite eagerly anticipated. And after the study group goes through and comments on each of those, the suggested changes and others are reviewed by DAB again and submitted to the council. And finally, the council approves the publication. Let's come to the framework and definition. We have concepts, we have standards, we have guidance, and we have basic principles. And we have, right at the bottom, the code of ethics, which is the foundation on which everything lies. The code of ethics is not new. The same code of ethics which applies to us in all other spheres of practice applies to those in the forensic accounting and investigation field. Spend some time on the definition before we move into the other aspects. The first definition is forensics as a word comes from a Latin word fora, which means to prove in a public forum. So when we say prove in a public forum, it means that the requirements are far more stringent than in our regular work. So, which means over a period of time, the Latin word forum has come to mean that we finally go to somebody for a decision before some kind of an authority. So when we go to an authority, it could be a disciplinary authority in a company, it could be an appellate authority, it could be an arbitration authority, it could be a court, it could be a regulatory authority like SEBI or EO, or an investigation kind of authority like the EOW. So the requirements of evidence collection and presentation become very stringent. Second word we have there is investigation. I'll cover forensic accounting a little more when we do the first standard. Investigation is, there's a specific purpose. There's a trigger, and we do an investigation. Now, one thing you would realize is we have consciously avoided the use of the word audit. We are staying with two words, forensic accounting and investigation. Now, the primary reason for using these two new words is number one, audit is a periodic activity. Whether it is statutory audit, internal audit, stock audit, or most audits. They happen every year with a regularity which is governed by a time and a deadline and a fixed period of review. Now, forensic assignments by nature are triggered by a particular activity. Either there is a loss and there's a suspicion of a fraud, or there is an event which causes suspicion and people want an investigation. The event could be something like a default, a non-repayment, a particular occurrence in the shareholding pattern, could be a fluctuation in the share prices. There could be any event. So when you investigate such an event, the expectation is that you go down to the cause. So once again, there is a much vaster scope in terms of you may not be restricted to a single year or 2 years or even 3 years. Second is, from the admin team, am I audible? I'm hearing some sounds on my PC. Can someone from the tech side confirm that I'm audible? Or I was just hearing some sounds, so I was wondering. Okay, thank you. So an investigation happens on a trigger. It usually wants you to trace to the origin. It also is not satisfied with an opinion. In the case of fraud, they actually want you to confirm whether it occurred or it did not occur. There are some which want a quantification. So the entire way in which the investigation is done is far different from an audit. So we are not to use the terms interchangeably. I understand whenever we do physical sessions that a lot of people do refer back that banks, regulators, and others are accustomed to the term audit. But as a community, I guess we need to go out to them, explain the differences. We're not, as forensic investigators, supposed to do the work of a statutory auditor, for example. And the statutory auditor is not expected to get into this kind of detail of investigating previous years to uncover frauds. Their side is limited, that if they think there are employee-related frauds possible, if they have reason to believe, they should be highlighted in the report. And they should be brought to the attention of the audit committee or the government, depending on the value. Now, coming to the standards per se, we put up a standard framework. We'll have an introduction. We will give the objective. We'll say what is required from the standard. If some concepts are introduced, we explain them. We tell you what is the documentation required, and the effective date is the 1st of July of this year. Next, we come to what we call the basic principles. The first 5 are what I call attributes, and the next 5 are what we call related to more the situation. The attributes are for the individual, and the others are for the engagement, shall we say. So the attributes are simple. You should be independent, you should have integrity, your work should be objective, take due professional care, we should have skills, we should have competence, we should maintain confidence. Most of these are extremely common with the assignments we do. The only difference I would perhaps point out is that confidentiality is far more dominant in these assignments. In the event that they eventually go into litigation and things like that, you should be very careful that everything goes on a need-to-know basis, because once matters involve fraud, you should be more careful with what you disclose. It gives the fraudster opportunities to cover their tracks. We don't know the chain of the fraudster and who all is involved in the beginning. So confidentiality has a far, far wider impact compared to other assignments we do. But most of the other 4 are as applicable in other assignments as there are here. Let's come to the other ones. Contextualization of the situation. When we come to fraud risk, we will talk about this a little more, but there is a concept that we follow a methodology to identify unusual events in the course of an investigation. Unusual events could mean, in terms of organization, large inventories at particular times of the year. Could mean large receivables at particular periods compared to others. With regard to employees, it could mean people not taking leave at all, individuals. Individuals working very late. These are the standard things which stand out whenever we review the operations of an entity under investigation. But we also need to understand and contextualize the observation. For example, Diwali is a large buying season for consumers. So it is expected, for example, that there will be a large stocking up prior to Diwali. or any other kind, or if you look at a seasonal industry, air conditioners will move a lot more during the summer months as compared to the winter months. Woolens would move a lot more in winter. So when it comes to an industry, we need to understand the industry, understand how it works, and interpret the data we find in the context of the industrial situation. The other example I gave you of people working late. Chartered accountants, either in industry or in practice, near annual closing time, always work late. Those in practice work late and work on Saturdays, Sundays during tax audit times. They work during income tax filing times. They usually are there on the GST deadline times. So in context, if it's logical, just because it's an outlier number doesn't mean that something is wrong, is that principle. The second principle is what is defined as the primacy of truth. Now, this is a very, very important concept. When we get into a forensic assignment, there is already what we call a predication or a trigger. There is also a suspicion. A partner calls me to investigate his firm because he thinks another partner is siphoning money. A company presumes that there is something wrong in the procurement department, which is why the cost of procurement is going high, or that there are losses in the warehouse. Or a bank calls us to investigate a bad loan because it thinks that the borrower has siphoned off the money. Now, these are our appointing people. So the tendency is to investigate in line with the outcome they expect, which is incorrect. The principle says, doesn't matter what is the expectation. Look at the investigation, look at the data which comes out, analyze it, and go with where the truth takes you. It may or may not be what you started out with. It may not satisfy the person who appointed you, but if that's the truth, that's what it is. And that overrides every other factor in an investigation. Next one, respecting rights and obligations. Now, this is a very interesting one. Because many times when we go into forensic investigations, we go in with our hands tied. We have non-cooperation of the, let's say in the case of a loan case of the borrower, or if it's a IBC related case, we may not even have the promoter available. As access, we generally deal with the resolution professional. In some cases, the promoters or directors are absconding. So it's very easy to classify those as potential suspects. But even in such cases, they have rights and obligations as well. So data has to be collected from data owners. It has to come in a legitimate format. You make your observations. The affected party against whom the conclusions are drawn should get an opportunity to confirm your data or even refute or rebut your conclusions. So these are two factors which even courts pay a very large emphasis. There was a controversial Supreme Court judgment some time ago, which actually mandated that there should be a communication of the findings of forensic investigations, and they should be given the chance to respond. So the practice of this entire circle working between the investigator and the bank without involving the borrower in this case was frowned upon by the Supreme Court. So we need to respect that everybody has rights and obligations. And the other thing which this implies is we are investigators. Our job is to bring the facts to light. Decisions of guilt, innocence, or whatever, it's the job of the authority in the particular case. That's not the job of the investigator. Next one is also interesting. It talks about separation of fact from opinion. A lot of times these things overlap. When you get into, it happens often, when I get into an investigation, almost everybody has preconceived opinions about what is wrong and what is right. Now, those are opinions. Unless those are substantiated by the facts, they remain opinions. A good example of an opinion is a statutory opinion. In our opinion is how we start. That's an opinion. Over here, we actually quantify, for example, the fraud, or we identify fraudulent transactions, or in IBC, we identify extortionate or preferential transactions. So we're talking facts. The last principle, again, is common across all assignments. We should do quality work. Times are changing. Technology changes every day. Actually, that's out of date now. Technology changes by the minute, actually. And unless we continuously improve and evolve, we will not keep pace with the times. So that's about continuous improvement, and there's a standard on quality as well. So now let's just get into the individual standards. So we come to the concept standard. 110 talks of what's the nature of engagement, then we have fraud risk. So let's just get into the standards one by one. Now we reiterate what we just talked about when we did concepts. No part of the engagement shall refer to this as an audit or a forensic audit. The preferred words are accounting or investigation. And let's come to the nature of engagement. Nature of engagement says you can have three types of engagement. One, where the domain is forensic accounting. Two, where the domain is investigation. Three, where the domain is litigation support. We will come to all three and explain them shortly. But be aware that these are not individually watertight compartments. Investigation will leverage a lot of forensic accounting tools and techniques. Once you have done with the investigation, you may be called upon to provide litigation support. So while there are three different types of engagement, there always can be an overlap. So That being said, we need to get a feel of primarily what type of assignment it is so that we can plan our response to the inquiry or RFP or whatever is the opportunity accordingly, so that we know what are we getting into. Is this forensics? Is it investigation? Is it litigation support? So let's start with forensic accounting services. They could talk to you about looking at financial statement manipulation, fund diversion, anti-money laundering, related parties, valuations, laws, suspicious transactions, all these. While we are generally looking at this from a fraud investigation perspective, I always like to highlight that forensic accounting services have lots of positive connotations as well. In fact, we've used a lot of these techniques where servers were damaged, companies were subject to arson or fire and lost their accounting records. Forensics are very useful in reconstructing accounts. The valuation of intangible assets is another very nice and positive application of forensics. You could also use these techniques for due diligence and acquisitions and mergers and stuff like that. So don't always correlate forensics with the negative connotation. There are positive areas and good applications of forensics as well. So that's about forensics. Let's talk of investigation. Investigation is basically predication or a trigger. A fraud happens, you're asked to investigate. Insurance companies want to see if claims are fake. Whistleblower complaints, that is, somebody in an organization puts an anonymous or a named complaint that we think that this thing is not going right. We think that person isn't right. There are people who have issues with data breach, theft of intellectual property, for example, bribery, corruption. You get all these kind of allegations. Now, when they become specific, it now becomes an investigation. And the investigation could well use many forensic and other techniques. The word hypothesis is, I will come to. And the last part of the nature of engagement is litigation support. So one is there could be a competent authority where you need to make a testimony in your area of expertise. It could be a person in industry who is asked to comment on a particular function. Could be an accounting expert who is asked to comment on the validity of capitalizing or not capitalizing a particular item, or to comment on the method of valuation. So you could go there as to testify. Now, you could also be asked to testify about your report, if you made a report. You could also be asked to testify about something that you did as a witness. So these are litigation support services. Another field which is gaining prominence is alternative dispute resolution services like arbitration and things like that, where people try to come to an arbitration authority and present both sides of the case and take the decision. So try to hasten the process. So that's another service which is possible. So in this nature of engagement, we need to see primarily what is this assignment about. Is it about forensic accounting? Is it about investigation? Is it about litigation? Once we've covered that, we come to the second standard in this series, which is fraud risk. Now, fraud risk is a very broad topic, but you need to assess the kind of risk which exists in the nature of the assignment we are executing. So let's look at three things. One risk in fraud is a lack of internal control. This applies across the board. Doesn't matter what company you're investigating. A preliminary review of internal controls opens your mind to the kinds of fraud risk that exist. And the other caveat I would give you is always look at internal controls in the context of the size of the organization under investigation. The larger the organization, the more complex the structure, the more elaborate the internal controls. The smaller the organization, the controls would be slightly more open compared to the larger organization. So here again, this is to contextualize the situation and see that given, even when we talk of reporting, the controls are always examined in the context of the nature, the size, etc. of the business, complexity. So internal controls is the first part. The second part is each type of industry has a different kind of operational or process risk. You could have a diamond cutting industry. You could have a glass blowing industry. You could have a textile industry. You could have an oil industry. So these are widely varied industries. And each one of them, by the nature of activities they perform, would have certain fraud vulnerabilities. For example, the oil industry is a lot of bulk transportation of liquids and gases, a lot of bulk storage of liquids and gases. All these are impacted by temperatures and variations. That's an area of risk we need to consider. A diamond industry, depending on the size, deals with very, very precious items. And most of them are smaller kind of entities. And the inventory controls are usually very flexible, to put it nicely. If we look at a glass or a textile industry, the context is that they have so many different kinds of output in terms of textiles or glass. And the variations between the value of the end product is a very insignificant input material or an additional process which they do on that particular item as a value add. So the manipulation to understand or investigate those, we need to understand these kinds of minute differences. The third area which constitutes fraud risk deals with compliance. Many times the fraud is to show compliance. Multiple industries have very, very different compliance norms, and by compliance, I will include environment, green audits, sustainability, and those kinds of standards which apply. So several times, because the standards are stringent, there is a risk that there is manipulation to show compliance. So once you've drawn up your fraud risk structure and the areas which need to be looked at, we're now slightly more ready to understand how our assignment is coming up. third part we talk about is, we covered most of this, except that it talks the concept of a fraud triangle, where you look at are employees disgruntled, are vendors disgruntled, are you paying fair amounts, are you paying fair compensation to employees, are you paying suppliers on time, is there very severe pressure on compliance and target achievement? Because these are indicators that trigger employees to or vendors to fraud. Laws and regulations. Now, since we are doing these investigations under the threat of finally ending up before a competent authority, there are some laws which I guess would apply to everybody. Mostly the Companies Act applies. Mostly we should have an understanding of the Evidence Act and whether what we gather would constitute evidence. Ashna Madam would cover this a little more in detail when she covers evidence. We would also be interested in seeing whether this fraud comes under any section of the Indian Penal Code or the Criminal Procedure Code. And if you're dealing with bribery and corruption, you're more interested in the prevention of corruption. Then we get into, depending on the nature of industry, are there industry-specific laws? For example, banking, forex, stock market manipulation, insurance companies, electricity companies, telecom companies. So each of these has their own set of laws. So while we need not know all of them, we should be able to identify the laws which are going to apply for our kind of engagement. The next part is, how competent are we in these laws in terms of identifying compliance or recording deviations? We'll come to work of an expert, but if there is complexity with respect to either the subject under investigation or the matter itself, there is scope to call in an expert. And we have a standard on using the work of an expert, so we will go there. 140. This is the last of our concept series, and it talks about applying hypotheses. This is a little new concept, which some of us may not be used to. So let me explain it in the context of something very simple in its origin. A hypothesis is used by a researcher in academics to say that I'm starting my research, for example, with the assumption that the majority of people in a particular country are obese and diabetic. Now, let's say the guy goes about investigating and taking surveys of different classes of people, different kinds of people, and he gets data. Now, there are going to be two things about this data. They were either going to support his hypothesis, or they are going to not support his hypothesis. Let's say he surveys some 1,000 people at the end, and he finds that hardly 100 people are overweight and about 200 people are diabetic, which constitutes 10 to 20%, which means the hypothesis that the people in this country, this state, or this city are obese and diabetic doesn't hold water. So that's the basic concept of how a hypothesis is used academically. Now, before we get into our investigation, it also means how fair is your data sample. Did you actually go to places where people are not overweight or people are healthy so that your statistics got skewed in favor of your hypothesis? Or did you take an unbiased sample, as we say? So that's the other provision. Now let's come to the fact that I am called upon to investigate a bad loan by a bank. And they're asking me to check if there's any fraud or what has happened. I generally take the hypothesis that a fraud has occurred, which is why the default happened. So the factors within my hypothesis are, if a fraud has occurred, that means money was spent other than the purpose for which it was given, which means it was either spent for another purpose within the company or it went outside the company. So once I look at all the spends, I should be able to identify instances where money was used for a different purpose or it went outside the company. If I can prove that, my hypothesis is proved. On the other hand, if I find the expenses are legitimate, it's not enough. Because then the bank is going to wonder where the money went. So then we go into the operations to understand if the money didn't go out, then why isn't he able to repay? There are losses. If there are losses, are the sales and purchases valued correctly? Are they reasonable in the context of that industry? Why is he not making the margin he's supposed to make? Why has his cash flow got affected? Common thing we see, at least in the ones now, is COVID impacted some of them. Change in regulations impacted others. Entrance of a competitor or a technology affects the company. So we need to get into all this as part of our hypothesis validation when we do a fraud investigation. Now, the RBI circular for investigating defaulting borrowers seems to want us to say fraud or no fraud. But in our standard, we've said we can prove, disprove, or not. Now, we've written not prove fairly deliberately. Not prove is, I don't have enough data to make an appropriate conclusion. If I don't have enough data, it means I didn't get it from the bank in terms of stock audit reports, DP reports, related decisions, or I've not got it from the borrower. So the route we can take is non-cooperation with respect to provision of data. But if we've got the data which is necessary for our scope, I think we'd have to say yes or no at the end. So that's about the key concepts. And now let's get into what we call managing the engagement. Managing the engagement, let's do some kind of parallel with the concept series. 210 is about engagement objectives. So 110 was about the nature of engagement. What were the purposes? Forensic investigation, litigation support, or what? So based on that, what are the objectives in terms of how are we doing? What is the scope? What's the period we're covering? Are we looking to cover specific transactions? What is the deliverable we're looking at the end of the engagement? Now, one thing we need to be very, very careful about in terms of engagement objectives is we can't commit to a particular outcome. We can't say you have to prove that X is a fraud. You can't say that the objective is to see how much money was siphoned. We need to be very, very careful with language here because it would get into litigation. If the language in the engagement objectives isn't right, the entire investigation would be thrown out and the report would be rejected on the basis of bias. So it's in the interest of both the appointee and the investigator that the language of the objectives is drafted very carefully. Investigate the possibility of fraud, very good. And for those who have any kind of issues, just refer the IBC 43, 45, 49, section 50 or section 66, whether there is preferential treatment, whether there is extortionate treatment, whether there are fraudulent transactions. You're asked to see if they are there. So there is no pointing to a particular outcome in the mandate. So as long as we maintain that, we're good. So you could say if or not there are financial statement manipulations, if or not there is fund diversion, if or not there's tax evasion, if or not the related party transactions are priced incorrectly, if or they don't. One thing I would put a caveat. Related party transactions are a matter of concern. Definitely there are. They merit investigation. But over the last couple of decades, there's a lot of focus on backward and forward integration so that you have a reliable supply chain. And a lot of this reliability and integration comes out of related parties. So again, remember the basic principle of contextualization of the situation. If we look at investigation services, we've covered a lot of this in the earlier slide. Could be theft, bribery, whistleblowing investigations, code of conduct, ethic violations, intellectual property, etc. We've done the litigation support services as well. Now we come to the fact of signing on the dotted line. Do we accept the engagement or what do we do? So we go back to what we did in the first set of concept standards. We understood the nature of the engagement. We've understood the fraud risk. We understand the sensitivity. We should do some preliminary procedures and verification as part of our due diligence to understand what is expected, what's the atmosphere, how hostile is the environment. Hostility, big word. You usually find very hostile environments in commodity-related investigations, sand mafia, oil mafia, transportation, and you need to have a lot of care for protection of the team. Then we also need to understand who are all the stakeholders involved, what's their expectation, will we be able to deliver in terms of delivery means, do we have the skills? Do we have the competence? Do we have the time? Do we have the tools which are necessary to conduct this assignment in accordance with the standards? If you don't have them, are you willing to take help? Are you willing to hire tools? Are you willing to buy tools? Are you willing to do the investment? Those are the kinds of considerations we do at the time of looking at whether or not we accept an assignment or not. We also look at the contract, look at the damages, look at how many open-ended clauses there are. Try to close as many loopholes as you can. Leave as few things open-ended as possible. The damages need to be restricted. And on a totally different note, there usually are damage clauses in these contracts. So you should have an insurance. So your negotiation for damages should be in line with what your insurance does. If you're getting more assignments, it's good. You need to help with your insurance. And you need to spend more money on insurance so that it covers the level of investigations that you do. Second is looking at how much you want to go. You should do the investments in tools. And once you think you have what you need, should go ahead and take the assignment. But then again, there's a tendency, if we don't define scope, if we don't define timelines, if we don't define expectations, and you don't define responsibilities of the other party, these investigations could get into very, very prolonged affairs. And anyone who has done them will say that they drain a lot of time, energy, and cash. So the drafting of the engagement is key. There are draft engagement letters and lots of advice in the implementation guide. And there's also an annexure in the standard per se, which tells you what all you could have and what you should take care. But in the end, it's a negotiation. There's this much we can recommend. But in the end, it's how well you manage the negotiation with the client. Next, we talked about using the work of an expert. There is a standard. Let's first look at the standard per se. Like we said, there could be intellectual property related, there could be forex related, there could be IBC related, there could be textile related, there could be diamond industry related, you could have an oil industry, you could have insurance, you could have electricity, you could have telecom, or any one of these industries. You could have mining. Each one of them comes with a completely different fraud environment and risk. And it's not possible for one person to know enough detail of each of these industries. So unless you work with a very large organization, you would need the help of an expert from time to time in areas where we don't have the skill. So what the standard says, determine independently where you need the expert. Several contracts require you to take permission from the client in terms of whom you appoint, whether you can appoint them, what's going to be the scope, what's going to be the NDA. Is the NDA to you and your NDA to the client? Do they want him to execute or her to execute a separate NDA? Would they want to review your expert and validate that how good they are? Other part is how would you evaluate? It's an area where we're not that good. So would we be able to evaluate the quality of work done and find whether the evidence or whatever he comes up with is reliable? And in the end, what it says is that you retain responsibility for the conclusions of the expert, which become part of your final report. So we're outsourcing the work, we're availing the expertise, but we're keeping the responsibility. That's a tricky one. So let me try and explain it from my context. Now, this is a personal explanation. Different people would have different ways of dealing with it. Now, let's say, for example, that I get an assignment to investigate, what do we say, stock market manipulations resulting in severe changes in stock prices for a particular company. And there are charges of insider trading and stuff like that. And in the midst of all this, there's lots of futures and options and off-market deals and curb deals and things like that. It's not an area I am good at. And it's not an area I know at all. But for an example, we take Ashna Madam is the expert on this kind of area. And since I know her very well, I can always call her as an expert. But the way I look at this, there's an assignment I would not take. Because there's not a field which I am not aware. I don't have a clue about the majority of the assignment. And I would rely on the expert for almost 80% of the report. Which means I'd much rather tell the client, you approach the expert, they are much better at this than I am. And I can certify that they are very good. Now let's take the other example. My expertise, let us say, is in the manufacturing industry. There's a company which is in the manufacturing business. It sources a lot of its raw material from abroad. And as a result, it has a lot of Forex exposure. And as a result, it also deals with a lot of fluctuation in raw material price. And to counter this, they do commodity trading and a little bit of hedging, both with their commodities and with the Forex. Now, this is something I'm good at. I have no problem in taking an expert to look at the hedging and the transactions which are used to shield them from the risk of Forex or commodity price fluctuation. That's about 5 to 10% of the assignment. The rest is what they do with it, how they sell it, how they market it, how they finance their manufacturing operations, how they manage working capital, how do they get their DP, and things like that. That's my area. So I would use the expert because in this area, then I can do whatever the standard asks me to do. I would evaluate the credentials. I would define the scope. Based on what I know of commodity pricing and the Forex rates, I would be in a position to evaluate the adequacy of work. And I would have no problem in retaining ultimate responsibility for the assignment conclusions. The other area where I would use an expert is, I'm not from the IT generation. In fact, I began my career when we wrote the books by hand. And getting the trial balance to tally used to be an achievement. So if I come across a situation where the promoter is absconding, we found some computers in a particular place, they have some data, they don't have other data. A lot of the emails are deleted. I would have absolutely no qualms in calling an expert. Use a tool like Encase, or if there's mobile data available, something like Oxygen. Use all that, recover what you can, tell me what's deleted, give me the logs, explain what you found to me, give me the data you can extract, and I will start my audit. Here again, the investigation I'm doing, what the expert helped me with is to extract data which is otherwise not available. A technical domain expert. Madam would cover this also a little bit when she does the 400 series. But that's another area where expertise is possible. I could take experts to look at a network to analyze traffic and what went in and what went out. So if that's a small part of the assignment, I wouldn't take up a network audit, for example, complete. It's not something I could do. Or if the fraud relates to manipulation of networks or IP addresses and the investigation is all about that, that's something I can't do. So I would not call an expert there. I'd ask the expert to conduct that themselves. So that being said, let's move to the next one. Slightly bigger one called engagement with agencies. We've talked about agencies, law enforcement, and there could be regulatory bodies. Now, there's nothing significantly different in this, but we need to be very clear where our role begins and ends and where is that of the agency. Agree on who communicates with the stakeholder. Is it through the agency or do they allow you to go directly? Understand the work procedures and guidelines which the agency per se has to follow in the investigation. If I'm working as a member of their team, I am bound by those laws and procedures that the agency does. And the other thing is, again, I come back to evidence. Whose custody does the evidence stay with? Is it our custody or is it with the custody with the agency? If the custody is with the agency, the same way when we hand it over to a management or a competent authority, we follow the procedure to hand over the evidence to the agency so that once we hand it over, the responsibility remains with the agency. Now, what are agencies? Let's cover that in some detail. There's CBI, there's Enforcement Directorate, there's EOW, there's SFIO, there's Income Tax Investigation. And these are actually all opportunities for getting work. And while it's not an area I practice in very significantly, what I have seen is it's with the backing of an agency, access to data, access to people, and other things is obviously a lot easier than going about as a private forensic investigator. Regulatory bodies, in terms of Reserve Bank, SEBI, IRDI, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board. So those are the kind of people who would appoint you. And like I said, when you're appointed by them, while the standards are there, you would also need to be aware of the procedures and laws which govern their function. And At the same time, be very clear as to where your roles are demarcated. Are there gray areas where you both go together? And what is the sole preserve of the agency? I re-emphasize the sole preserve of the agency because there is a tendency in some cases that we assume that if I work with the CBI or I work with the ED or the EOW, I become the CBI. I don't. I'm working with them. So sometimes working together, we need to keep that partition in our mind. Even though we go to work together, we have lunch together, we get out of the front door together in the evening, we may go on tour together, stay in the same hotel. They are CBI or EOW and their powers are vastly different. So remember the demarcation. What am I supposed to do? What we do together and what is their exclusive preserve. With that, let's come to the last standard in my area, which is communication with stakeholders. Now, this is something which is very much a part of engagement management, and it gets into how are we going to talk and who are our affected parties. So we define in the standard two things. One is who is my primary stakeholder. And we define the primary stakeholder as the person who appoints us. Anyone else is another stakeholder. Second thing is we should have a laid down procedure and a broad protocol in which we would communicate with our stakeholders. Once you have this down, then following it becomes a little simple. Second thing the standard does, it differentiates between two types of communication. One is what we call essential communication, and the other is what we call significant matters. Public and media should be as little as possible, unless completely unavoidable. So let's understand essential. Essential relates to execution. Laws and regulations, anything you find, scope and methodology, support, cooperation, non-pro cooperation, engagement fees, definitely essential. What's your periodic reporting? What's your agreed format? Significant. You're not getting cooperation. Delays. People are withholding information. You don't get access. Intimidation, domination by particular stakeholders. Potential conflict of interest. Destruction, alteration of evidence. Breaks in chain of custody. Safety or life-threatening situations. These are matters on which we communicate. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of conflict of interest. I'm doing a loan-related assignment where, among other things, we find that the bank has not acted on information available to it. A particular officer in the bank. Working capital limits were approved without looking at the related reports. If some information available should have impacted the drawing power, for example, it didn't impact. There was a physical visit to the site. they should have caught some discrepancy either in inventory or in fixed assets, which they didn't catch. This is a potential conflict of interest with possibly the primary stakeholder. That is definitely significant. And safety, life-threatening situations, withdraw from the engagement, absolutely no question. If at any time there's a perceived threat to the safety of you, your team member, or anybody else, then that is definitely a situation where you withdraw. The other thing I would like to communicate on communication is, while communication is essential, as an investigator, three locations of the client to look at particular transactions, to look at stock, maybe to interview a particular person, maybe in his work environment. I am a guest of the organization. I need to communicate which are the places I need to go and when I will be there. They need to make necessary passes for me to enter that premise. So that is essential. I have to tell him that. As part of normal civil conversation, the concerned vice president, general manager, whoever it is going to ask me in conversation, why would you like to go? Especially if out of pocket is additional in my assignment, they're very curious as to whether it's important or not. So in that context, I need to give him a reason. The reason need not be a lie and include 6 factors other than my principal objective, so that they're aware what I need. So what I need also should be there. You can add a lot of other things which you can look at. If you want to interview one guy, ask him to interview 4 people. Include them all. So the communication is there. There's nothing which is hidden. They have the opportunity to prepare for your visit. At the same time, you withheld enough information as is necessary to conduct an independent and impartial investigation. So that's it about communication. And I'm near the end of what I had to cover. So if there are any particular questions or anything which has come up, I'd be happy to answer. Or else Ashna madam can take over. Yes, Akanksha ji, I'm done.
Thank you so much, sir. It was indeed an insightful session. Next, we have with us is Ms. Ashna Khanna, who's a chartered accountant by profession. She's a manager in forensics team with PwC and has over 7 years of professional experience in providing services to several multinational and domestic clients. Her areas of work include performing investigations of financial frauds and whistleblower complaints, anti-bribery and anti-corruption reviews, fraud risk assessments and process reviews, development of policies, and conducting trainings for clients, among others. She has worked with clients across diverse industries. Most recently, she has also been a member of ICI study group, which provided feedback on revision of draft standards and drafting of guidance notes to the standards. Today, we have Ms. Ashna Khanna as a speaker who will be providing us with an overview of forensic accounting and investigation standards from Series 300 to Series 600. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Akanksha, for that introduction. Before I start off, just want to check I'm audible, right, to everyone?
Yes, ma'am.
And y'all are able to see my screen? Great. So I think I'd like to start with first, thanking ICI and the entire group, of dignitaries who have been involved in not only developing, but so much thought process which went into coming out with these forensic accounting and investigation standards. And, like Akanksha mentioned, I was closely involved in drafting. We had so many discussions where we thought how we could, improve these and make these most relevant for all the forensic accounting and investigation professionals. And it feels great to be able to take this webinar and to walk you all through some of those standards. I hope a lot of you all as ICI members have read it, but we're going to cover a quick summary here, and I hope that you all find this session insightful and helpful. So we'll be starting off with the series 300 standards, which talk about how to execute a forensic accounting and investigation assignment. There are 6 standards in this series, and we'll go one by one. So, starting with the first one, it's about planning the assignment, right? So, I think before we discuss how to plan an assignment, we need to first understand what is the difference between an engagement and an assignment. Many people use these terms very interchangeably, not realizing that there is a thin line of difference between both of them. An engagement is the overall contractual mandate which is there between the professional and the primary stakeholder, right? So, this is a more broad and all encompassing term, while an assignment is a part of the engagement or a portion of the overall engagement. So, if I have to give you all an example, let's say a client approaches you, they received a whistleblower complaint, they want to do an investigation, right? Now, in the overall engagement, you would have various assignments. One could be performing e-discovery procedures, two could be performing certain document review or data analysis, and so on, right? So it's not necessary that the entire engagement scope would be assigned to you as an FBI professional. There might be multiple other professionals who might be working on that mandate. So in that case, assuming that just the e-discovery scope is assigned to you, that would be your assignment, whereas the overall engagement, which contains all of those work steps, would be the engagement, right? And planning an assignment is very important because that sort of sets the course or determines the course in which all the work steps will take place, right? And a good plan helps ensure that you're able to gather evidence, you're able to reach the conclusions that you want to reach. But the first key to planning the assignment is understanding what the objectives of the assignment are, right? So these objectives would be understood based on discussions with the primary stakeholders, what the subject matter of the assignment is, what is it that they want to achieve, why have they engaged us, and so on, right? And the main thing while planning the assignment is to always keep in mind not only the objectives but also the scope of the engagement, right? And how we plan the assignment would depend on various factors, including, most importantly, the nature and the complexity of the assignment, right? That would determine how detailed the plan would be, what would be the different sub steps in that plan, and so on. And that would determine the extent and depth of the procedures that one would perform. So on my screen, you can see some of the key elements which are required to be considered while planning the assignment, which will also help achieve the objectives. First and foremost is the knowledge of the relevant business and environment, right? So I don't think any of us can plan the assignment or, more than planning, even have a discussion with the primary stakeholders unless we are aware of what business model and operating environment the client has, right? In terms of what kind of departments and divisions they have, what risks they face. Sometimes there are industry nuances which one needs to know, or there might be recent news in the public domain which may be very relevant to how you plan the assignment, right? Second, like I said, are the risk considerations. So, considering the geographical territory the client operates out of, the industry, the business model, or the kind of touch points or customers or vendors that the client has interactions with, there would be different risk considerations. And of course, the most important risk that we consider is the fraud risk, right? So it's essential that we always keep our eye out for the fraud risk indicators and make sure that our plan adapts to all those indicators. Third, as I mentioned, discussion with stakeholders, right? There's only so much information that we can find from the public domain or the client's websites and things like that, or by reviewing documents, downloading financial statements from the MCA website, and so on, right? There are some inputs or insights which only the client themselves can provide us. And I think in order to make sure that the plan is very efficient and focused, it's important to have multiple discussions with the stakeholders. It doesn't mean that we just have a preliminary discussion and then we are done with it and we go about the entire assignment, right? It's important that we periodically check in with the stakeholders, to see if any additional information has come to light, which they would like to tell us about. Simultaneously, we would like to update them about how we are planning our work procedures, what hypothesis we are developing, and so on, right? So there has to be a two-way flow of information and discussion with stakeholders at all times. Fourth is about technology deployment, right? So when we are talking about the nature and extent of procedures to be defined, it's important to also think about what kind of tools and techniques or technologies we would like to deploy on the engagement or the assignment for that matter. And that would of course also depend on what kind of data we have access to, right? So basis that we would need to design our procedures. And it's important to have that conversation with clients so that they know why we are requesting for a certain data point, what is its relevance and importance in the overall assignment structure, and just explaining to them what kind of technology we will use and what results it will help us produce for them, right? The next one is resource allocation, which is something very important, which not many talk about. And this is also a very interesting documentation requirement, which is there in the standard, right? So we've discussed that FAIS is a very specialized set of standards which apply to all professionals who would work on such assignments. So it's very important that within firms or within entities, the resources who are allocated to different assignments are actually skilled, competent, and knowledgeable enough to perform those assignments, right? It purely cannot be based on who is available, or engagements cannot be understaffed. We need to make sure that the right set of people are there so that the objectives can be achieved, and moreover the plan can be accomplished, right? And relevant elements of the plan need to be well documented. So the standard does give certain leeway to teams to decide how to document the plan. It could be in the form of checklists, or putting out the different work steps that need to be performed, what kind of procedures, documentation needs to be maintained. But I think what is most important is, most people think that you can define a plan at the beginning of the assignment and be done with it. It's documented and no one comes and looks at it again. uh, you need to know that planning is an ongoing and periodic process, right? Based on the information you obtain throughout the course of the assignment, you may want to edit aspects of the plan, you may want to add aspects, you may feel some things are not relevant anymore and you may want to delete those, right? So it's necessary that your plan is flexible enough to adapt to all these things. And accordingly, all of this needs to be documented in the form of even minutes of meetings if necessary, right? Which basically sets out the whole course as to how your plan evolved. Right. Moving on to the next standard, which is number 320 on evidence and documentation, right? So considering that now you have a plan in place, right, the next thing everybody wants to do in an assignment is to get gathering evidence, right? And everybody wants that the evidence should be relevant, reliable, and it should either prove or disprove the hypothesis. But before we get into the crux of the standard, let's understand what is evidence and what is documentation, right? Again, these terms as well are used very interchangeably, but there is a thin difference. So evidence is any sort of information. It could be written, oral, it could be in hard copy form, it could be in electronic form. It's something that's gathered across the course of the assignment. Whereas documentation is the aggregate of all of that evidence that you gather, and it also includes what data you obtain from clients, the work procedures that have been performed, the conclusions we have reached, the report that we have drafted, and so on. So clearly here, documentation is the larger, wider term, and evidence specifically, refers to what we gather in terms of our objectives. So when we talk about evidence, right, it's not that any evidence would be acceptable, either for your assignment. you always need to consider that, FAI assignments are specialized, and at any time they could, move into a court of law, or you might be asked to testify before a competent authority. So the most important thing is that the evidence that we gather needs to be gathered from a reliable source. It should be capable of being, reproduced, and it should satisfy the requirements to go in for a legal recourse, right? Like I mentioned, for each assignment you might have different objectives, so any evidence you gather has to be related to that, and it has to, help you achieve either one or more of those objectives, right? And some may question that what is the limit for gathering evidence. There is no limit, as long as it's appropriate and, considering the contours of the assignment, it can be considered as sufficient. Then, that's what needs to be gathered. And like I said, some evidence you may gather may help to prove a hypothesis or disprove a hypothesis. Sometimes you may not have enough evidence to even prove the hypothesis, right? So based on that, we need to constantly tweak the plan and move along with that. And the evidence should be such that you can draw reasonable conclusions from it. And what is most important about the evidence gathering is the source, right? So it has to be reliable. There needs to be a chain of custody documentation which is maintained, right? In terms of from where we got it, in what form we got it, in what nature, were there any changes made to it? And we'll talk about some of this in the other standards, which I'm going to speak about, especially the one on data analysis, right? So that is why maintaining the chain of custody is very important. And the ownership or the custody of all the evidence, not only the evidence but the overall documentation also, needs to lie with the FAI professional, right? Because we are the ones who are going to be gathering that evidence, we are the one who are going to draw reasonable conclusions from it. We might be the ones who need to testify tomorrow before a competent authority. So we need to make sure that it is secure, it is stored well, integrity, data protection, all of that is maintained, right? And just one point to add is, in case oral evidence is there, of course, oral evidence is there in many FAI assignments, especially when we are having discussions with targets or interviews with them. But please do try to see if you can get a written statement, so that that is more reproducible in the court of law, right? It is always advisable to get attested statements from targets when we speak to them, so that tomorrow no facts can be distorted or evidence cannot be tainted, right? So I think those are the key points we talk about when we speak about this standard, which is number 320 on evidence and documentation. The standard number 330, which is next, is about conducting work procedures, right? Now, again, FAI assignments are very different, diverse in nature. There's no standard checklist which tells you that you need to perform these 5 steps and this will help you achieve the objectives, right? So a various number of FAI activities need to be defined and need to cohesively be put together so that you can work on the assignment, right? Now, generally, the standard helps to split the phases of the assignment into phase 1 and phase 2. So phase 1 is generally what we call the beginning phase or behind the scenes phase, where it's more focused on having discussions with the stakeholders, getting more information about the client, understanding their nuances, who are the individuals involved, and so on, right? So there isn't that much of actual interaction with the targets, right? Because you first want to accumulate all the information with yourself so that you have enough to go and conduct discussions with them, right? Or to highlight certain trends or anomalies or fact patterns to them. And phase 2, is where the actual crux arrives, where there's actually a need to engage with the relevant stakeholders, right? Either to obtain more information about the processes they handle and deal with, or to get explanations from them, and so on, right? But what is very important is that, again, the work procedures need to be in line with the scope, the objectives, and the plan. And they need to be discussed with the primary stakeholders, right? Because they need to be on board with what we are planning to do. There are many assignments, where clients do not give us access to conduct discussions or interviews, with the targets, right? for many reasons, because they don't want the employees at the client location to be aware that, so and so whistleblower complaint has been received, who it is against, what is the complaint alleging, and so on, right? So purely for confidentiality terms as well, or to just make sure that there's no unrest at the client location, you may not get access, to the targets. So in that case, having that discussion with stakeholders is important, because then you know that, okay, that is a work procedure that you can't perform, right? And again, the work procedures that we define at the beginning of the assignment are not set in stone, or they're not sacrosanct, right? Throughout the course of the assignment, if we believe that we need to modify, add, delete work procedures, then we should definitely do that. And that is completely acceptable as long as all of these work procedures are in accordance with the relevant laws and regulations, right? So as long as none of those are being violated, or you're not, having a non-compliance with any of those, it's totally acceptable, right? And for each work step, you may decide either to, do manual work steps, or there might be tools and techniques involved, right? Couple of examples that I can think of is when it comes to data analysis, we use various platforms like BI and SQL and queries, so that if we have a lot of voluminous or complex data, we can crunch it, structure it, and, try to immediately identify the pattern that we're looking to find. Same way when it comes to, like I said, investigation of whistleblower complaints, there is a lot of emphasis on performing e-discovery procedures, right? So again, there are a lot of tools that, FAI professionals use to sort of extract that electronic data from the electronic devices of the targets, right? That could be from laptops, cell phones, it could be server backups, and so on, right? So what is very important is to correlate each of those work procedures with your objectives, what hypothesis you're developing, right? So that way, at least you have a check that you have thought of all the different work procedures that could be conducted considering whatever data and information is available to you, right? And, most often we see that these are documented in our report, but it's also good to have these in our work papers, right? Many a times we either insert an extract, or we only, talk about those work procedures which we actually performed, or those which actually yielded results. But, if you have an exhaustive list of the procedures performed, in your working papers, then that would be helpful for anyone who is also doing a review and supervision of the assignment. And, along with that, like I said, you can document what is the outcome of the work procedure, were there any limitations faced, and so on. Right. The next one is, something I've been talking about quite a bit, which is about conducting interviews, right? Everyone finds investigation interviews or interrogative interviews very interesting, but actually they are a very, hard task, because, like the overall assignment or engagement, there is a lot of planning which goes into conducting interviews as well, right? In fact, if we look at how the standard defines interviews itself, we see that, interview refers to a structured meeting with individuals for eliciting information, right? So considering it's a structured meeting, you need to plan in advance, right? So basis all the evidence you've gathered, you need to first identify that who are the targets or the stakeholders that you want to conduct interviews with, right? So again, the count and the names of the people you select will depend on all of this, and it's always advisable to get this pre-cleared from the client, right? Because they are the ones who will help you set up the interviews with them. So it's always, advisable to have a rationale for selection as to why you've selected that individual, what is the information you want to seek from them. Sometimes the objective may not be to seek information, but you might want to corroborate the existing information you already have, right? In many instances, you already have a proof of their wrongdoing or misconduct as well, but all you want to do is, get their take on it or get their views on it. And, in any interviews, we also see that people even accept to the wrongdoings they've done, when they realize that we have the evidence against them. So, like I said, a lot of planning goes into it. Also deciding where you want to have the interview, right? That's also important. How many people will be there in the interview? Because you don't want to intimidate the person you're discussing with either. So it's always good to have, senior people who are not only part, but who are also conducting the interview, right? Because they are experts in their domain, or they are experienced enough to conduct these interviews, or to deal with the sensitive matters which may come up in an interview, right? And the most important thing to conducting an interview is drafting a questionnaire, right? So being very clear about what you want to ask, because more often than not we don't have multiple hours or an entire day to sit with people in a room and conduct these. So they need to be focused and to the point, right? And sometimes even in the course of the interview you may realize that either the interviewee genuinely does not have the information you're seeking, or they might just be withholding information, or they might be deviating from the topic. So based on that you may need to alter your course of questions and your course of action, right? So that kind of flexibility needs to be there, to decide what questions to ask, when, in what flow, and what kind of information to seek from them. Couple of other very important things when it comes to an interview, right? Some of us tend to maintain minutes of the interviews, but like I said, it's always advisable to get a written statement which is attested and authorized by them, because there are so many instances where later people claim that they have given these statements under duress, or they've been pressurized to accept some of these things even though they're actually not true. So as a best practice, it's also good to have some key members or stakeholders from the client side. If the client has a designated ethics team, then great, you could have the ethics head or officer. But assuming they don't have a dedicated ethics team, then there's always people from the legal team or HR team whom you can have during the interview, right? And of course, everyone is sensitized that interviews are very confidential, and no details of what is discussed during the interview or the outcome of the interview as well, right? Whether you find the target to be guilty or not, none of that is supposed to go out off that room, or it's not to be disclosed to anybody who was not part of the interview, right? And even if it is disclosed to somebody who's not part of the interview, they need to be either the primary stakeholders, or if there are other stakeholders, then please make sure you have the due approvals before you share the information with them, because any information in the wrong hands can sensitize other targets at times. We've seen cases where employees have done mass deletion activities on their laptops, and it becomes really difficult for us to retrieve evidence regarding them, right? So always be careful of that and maintain confidentiality. And like I mentioned, when you make a list of the people you want to conduct the interview with, you may also decide suddenly to exclude someone, or for whatever reason you may not have access to them, they could be on a vacation, anything. In that case also, please make sure that in the working papers it is documented that initially, yes, you did set out to interview 10, maybe you actually interviewed 7, and what is the delta, right? And what is the reason or the rationale for not conducting the interview with them. So, if I have to summarize the standard, it would be that, please always make sure that the highest standards of independence, objectivity, and impartiality are adhered to while conducting an interview, because it's very easy for people to say that there is a sense of bias, or that you are trying to threaten them, and so on, right? Many people believe that if you give them a false threat, the target will accept the wrongdoing, but these are really not acceptable tactics or practices which are acceptable, or should not be done during an interview. The next one, standard number 350, review and supervision, very important, right? I mean, considering that we've covered so many standards which talk about planning the assignment, what laws to follow, how to draft the engagement letter, so much. So considering that there are people who are following and adhering to so many standards, there also needs to be someone to review and supervise them, but naturally, right? So review is basically, again, the examination of how you planned the assignment, what work you performed, what evidence you gathered, what work papers you documented, and so on, right? Supervision is again the broader term here, which talks about the general oversight of the team which is working on the assignment. And a supervisor would just be someone who is always available or accessible, who could provide guidance at any time that the team needs it, right? And anybody who thinks review and supervision is not necessary, I have competent resources on the team, that's just not true, because however experienced the team is or however skilled they are, there's always need for a senior member to be there to review, supervise, and oversee the work, right? So, first and foremost, like I said, is to monitor, right? Whether the plan has been followed, whether the work steps have been performed, not only in terms of completeness, but also have they been done efficiently and effectively, right? Um, it does not help to just do a very high level work step and then claim that it's been completed. So if it requires the FAI professional to go into certain depths or to look at multiple data sets and corroborate those findings, then that needs to be done, and all of this needs to be done in the ambit of the laws and regulations that are there, right? um, we have so many laws like the Companies Act. We have our very own ICI, which has also notified the accounting standards. We have Ind AS, and of course, basis the subject matter of the assignment, there could be certain specialized laws which apply. So always make sure that you are within the contours of that, and to make sure that the evidence gathering process has been comprehensive, right? Like I said, there could be multiple sources of gathering evidence. There could be multiple forms in which evidence could be gathered. So all of that needs to be reviewed to make sure that there are no gaps or nothing has been missed by the team, most importantly, right? Because any potential miss by the team could just change the entire outcome of the assignment or the engagement, or in terms of what conclusions you've drawn from it. So of course the extent of the review and supervision will vary. That is something which is again left the best judgment, or rather the professional judgment of the forensic accounting and investigation professionals. So they can determine, basis the subject matter, the complexity involved, how detailed the review should be, how periodic it should be, right? I mean, of course, if it's a short term assignment, you will not be able to review that periodically. But if it is a long term engagement which has multiple assignments or multiple phases like we discussed, then in that case it would be good to have a periodic review in place, right? And it's not just necessary to do the review or to be there to supervise. Again, documentation is key, right? I think thankfully we have fairly detailed standards and guidance notes and implementation guides, which set out, I wouldn't say it's again set in stone, but it's an indicative list of what kind of documentation you can maintain. So I think that serves as a very good ready reckoner for anyone who just feels a bit lost, or who wants to have a checklist to just make sure they aren't missing anything. So documentation of review and supervision should of course be in writing. It could be a hard copy which is reviewed by someone. It could be in the electronic form over email. That's open to the FAI professional, but the evidence of the review should definitely be there. And of course, what is the outcome of the review itself, right? I mean, did the reviewer or the supervisor find everything to their satisfaction, or did they identify any deviations? Are the reasons for those deviations well documented? All of that needs to be there in place, right? So I mean, I know when I talk about these standards in detail, some of y'all might think that this is a lot to comply with, or it just sounds complicated, but trust me, it's not. A lot of this is what we are already doing. I think what these standards just seek to do is put a method to the madness, right? So we tend to maintain this maybe at our own local files, or we have it for some projects, we don't have it for some. That kind of inconsistency is what these standards are looking to plug, so that the quality itself of the services we are providing on an overall basis improves manifold. Right. Moving on to the next standard, which is number 360 and the last one in this series, right? And Sailesh sir rightly mentioned that I would cover this. So here we are. This is about testifying before a competent authority, right? So I think we've already established that at any given point of time, the matter that you're investigating or reviewing could go into the court of law. So in that case, it's very important that we adhere with the professional standard which is defined here, and we are compliant with that, right? So what this standard aims to do is it sets out the definition of some of the key terms that you all can have a look at whenever you have the time. It defines who is an adjudicating authority, who is a competent authority, what we talk about are the proceedings and what is a testimony, right? So all of you all must be familiar about this, that testifying is basically providing information and evidence to a competent authority, right? Now in some cases, when when the FAI professional is engaged itself, they know that they are being engaged to find evidence because their client wants to go to the court of law, right? In other cases, it may not be envisaged at the beginning of the assignment, but later, the FAI professional may receive a legal notice, telling them that, this matter has now moved to a court of law, right? So either ways, we need to be prepared to testify before a competent authority, right? And so one of the key criteria, right? I mean, of course, the standard does not mean that anybody and everybody can go and testify before a competent authority. It is essential that the professional who is specifically going to testify should be someone who has been involved throughout the course of the assignment or the engagement, right? Like I established, they should be senior or an expert in their domain, and they should have been, in that position where they reviewed and supervised the team, and they were also involved in preparing and finalizing the report, right? Because most often that is what one testifies about in the court, right, regarding the report issued by the professional. So, if I have to summarize, basically there should be evidence to show the involvement of the FAI professional, right? Because the most important aspect is that they need to know what they're presenting, they need to know what they've signed off and what's in the report, right? Nobody else can just come read the report and go in their place and testify. And so once you're sure that you have been thoroughly involved in the assignment and are qualified to testify, then comes the important principles that you need to ensure, right? Again, independence, objectivity, very, very important, because the prime and paramount responsibility of the person testifying is towards the court of law, right? You may think that your client or legal counsel has engaged you, they are the ones probably paying for the compensation, or you discuss the scope and procedures with them, but like I said, your responsibility is towards the competent authorities. So you need to make sure that anything you are presenting there is honest, and there should be no conflict of interest or bias at that point of time, right? And very important when you're presenting or testifying against, about your report, is suppose you have suffered any limitations or challenges, or you believe there was something which restricted you from performing all the work procedures or following the plan that you had charted out, please make sure that you notify the competent authority about that as well, right? Similarly, if there was some aspect of the subject matter that you didn't, investigate or look at, please specifically call that out as well, right? Because that would just ensure that the competent authority knows what was the clear scope of work that you looked at, right? And yeah, I think lastly, like I said, there are a lot of statutory provisions for testifying, for deposing in front of competent authority. So always make sure that you have a checklist of those laws so that you don't miss any key guidance which is there in any of those. And of course, there is this FAIS 360 that you need to comply with. All right. So moving on to the next series that we have, right, which is series 400. This talks about specialized areas, right? Now, this is the most interesting series, at least for me, because this, covers the actual work steps that we do. Till now, it's more of guidance in terms of do's and don'ts and best practices. So we'll cover all three of these one by one. The first one, 410, which is about applying data analysis, right? So, like Sailesh beautifully covered, like people need to stop calling it forensic audit. Anyways, people believe that, audit is a tick mark or checklist based approach, and where, we just physically look at vouchers and documents. I feel we have progressed, leaps and bounds from that. And, now we talk about, like I said, tools and techniques like data analysis and e-discovery, discovering data in the digital domain, and so much more that's coming up. I mean, we have artificial intelligence, machine learning, image analytics. There's so much great work that all our counterparts are doing. So let's talk about this standard, which is about applying data analysis, right? Now, of course, the objective of this is to obtain relevant data which you believe relates to the objectives of the assignment, the scope, the hypothesis that you're looking at, right? So let me give you an example. Let's say the client has received an allegation that the procurement manager is receiving kickbacks, or that he is according a preferential treatment to a certain vendor, right? So in that case, according to me, relevant data would be, of course, looking at the party wise, vendor wise procurement data, what has been procured, what materials, at what rates, right? And then sort of analyzing that to see if there are any trends, patterns, anomalies you can find, right? I mean, sometimes we see that there are huge variances in rates, right, of procuring the same product from different vendors. So that is something worth looking into. Or let's say you may not find huge variances in rates, but overall itself, when you do a market benchmarking exercise, you might find that the rates itself which are negotiated are too high, even though they've been constant throughout your review period. So it's amazing the kind of red flags that data can just throw out, right? More often than not, we also tend to do a lot of high level data analytics on financial statements, right? I mean, just sort of analyzing the movement in the balance sheet, or looking at how the statement of profit and loss items have moved from period to period itself, I feel sheds so much light on the client and the client's business. Of course, to corroborate some of those data patterns, you need more data, backup data in terms of listings. You may need certain documents. That is irrefutable. But of course, like I said, it at least gives you a sense of direction, that what kind of path can you pursue, and what kind of data points that you want to look at in terms of to eliminate whether these were any fraudulent indicators or not, right? So, there's an entire cycle which is beautifully defined in the standard, and I hope that some of you all will look at it later. But it basically starts from the beginning, which is the data source, right? Like I said, the source of the evidence is important, chain of custody is important. So what is the source of the data? Then we talk about the data acquisition, right? How have you acquired that data? Was it done by the client and then provided to you? Did you independently acquire or extract that data? That is very important, right? And in what form, right? And it's not that after we just extract the data, we immediately start analyzing it, right? There is a certain level of data validation or cleansing which needs to be done. And as part of validation, we first look at even basic things like just reconciling it, right, to the financial listings have, to make sure at least that it's complete, right? Can't assure accuracy, but at least see that it's complete, or it matches with the query that you ran to extract that data. Data integrity is also very important, right? In terms of which system you downloaded it from, who has access to it, are there logs and trails of it or not, right? And then I said, like you said, you do the data profiling. So you may have a really large listing which may be voluminous, it may have data for years put together, it may have hundreds of columns, but you profile the data because you would have in mind that, okay, I need to look at these data fields because these are the ones relevant for my analysis, right? And that is how you proceed with it. So all of these steps that you perform should be documented in something called a data analysis plan, right? So it starts from step one to the end of it, what analysis you did, what findings you got, right? So these are some of the key elements which definitely need to be adhered to. And these are also important, again, so that the evidence is admissible tomorrow in a court of law, right? Somebody should not be able to raise a question on the integrity of the data or the manner in which it was extracted and so on, right? So please always make sure that the admissibility is intact, right? And of course, right, considering that our client or the primary stakeholders have trusted us enough to have access to certain data of theirs, and needless to say, most of the data we look at in our assignments are always confidential in nature, right? So please make sure that you maintain confidentiality of it and the integrity of it, right? Please don't make sure that you don't upload it to some clouds where, let's say, all the people in your team have access, especially when we talk about even the data protection bill which is recently gotten passed. So, and if you have personal data, let's say of the client employees, especially those need to be managed very carefully, right? So make sure that you have a strong data preservation policy as well, in terms of even after your analysis or after you've issued your report, the assignment, let's say, is completed, the client is satisfied. How are you going to preserve the data or archive it? Sometimes, we have clients who ask us to just delete the data immediately after our work is done. So, make sure you adhere to your engagement terms when you consider this aspect, right? And of course, what is most important is having the expertise to run these data analytics, right? So there are so many courses which are available online these days which can help us to be certified in these techniques, so that we are, rest assured that we have looked at the data properly and, analyzed it well, and, taken the right findings from it. And again, finally, please make sure that any limitations or data assumptions you may have made, right? Like I said, you might not have always access to the client, but there might be some assumptions you might make while extracting or analyzing the data. Please make sure all that is documented in the working papers. That is what the standard aims to tell us. The next one, standard 420, talks about evidence gathering in the digital domain, right? We all know these days, everyone's working on emails, or, there's WhatsApp and things like that, right? Instant messenger and whatnot. So, it's much evident that, we need to look at even digital domain, right? It's not good enough to just look at invoices or contracts or payment documents and so on, right? There's just so much more in the digital domain which may either corroborate your hypothesis or finding, or it may give you additional information which is helpful in the same process, right? So that is why we have this standard, which again very clearly defines what is the ambit of a digital domain, right? Like I said, it includes the email servers, cloud, cyberspace, anything that the client may use, right? What qualifies as digital evidence and what e-discovery is, right? So e-discovery is, just simply put, it is electronic gathering, right, of electronic data. That is what it is. So, in most investigation assignments, we find this very helpful. And often I've heard, people say, okay, who even talks about all this on email anymore? Or, people are too smart. They'll delete it. They won't keep trails. They'll discuss it over phone. But you will still surprisingly find so many instances where people still discuss things on digital domain. There have been instances we have retrieved documents from a custodian's laptop where, we have found the entire breakup of the kickbacks they have received, right? Or we have found internal conversations which reveal names of more people who are involved, and that, I think, is one of the key objectives of any investigation we do, right? It's not only to prove whether someone is guilty or not, but also to identify the entire universe, to know who else is involved in those wrongdoings, whether they are fellow employees, whether they are third parties, and so on. So that is why, gathering evidence in the digital domain is very important, right? So again, there needs to be a due documented process for this. You need to be an expert in this domain to know how to access it, right? You need to have the right permissions and approvals from the client and the respective custodian whose data you're looking at, right? And a key to that is also getting an understanding of what information systems they use, how you need to maneuver it. In many cases, you also need, let's say, the device passwords before you can extract any data, right? And we have a lot of skilled FAI professionals who also work on, recovering as much deleted data as possible. Again, that's a great data trend. We have seen, so many cases wherein, custodians have deleted, like I said, voluminous data right before, their device was imaged, because they knew that if their device was imaged, so much evidence would be found, right? And I wouldn't say there's 100% success rate, but to a large extent, we are able to retrieve the deleted data or the deletion logs, right? Of course, that would depend on the information systems that the client has, but yes, we are able to do this in many scenarios. And the digital data which is extracted from the digital domain also needs to again be compliant with all laws and regulations, data privacy laws, confidentiality, integrity. Like I said, they have to be also, the data needs to be acquired through the right process. It cannot be by pressurizing or under duress, right? And the appropriate forensic tools and techniques need to be applied, so that tomorrow, again, if this evidence is presented in the court of law, it is apt for judicial scrutiny, right? We know that there's been this debate throughout whether WhatsApp evidence is a valid form of evidence or not. There are reasons it's not, right? So that is why, please make sure that when you do the e-discovery procedures, you are obtaining the right data from the right sources, and it's admissible, and there is a full trail, or a digital footprint of how you got it, how you cleansed it, processed it, and how you analyzed it, right? And there are a lot of tools and technologies like Intella, Relativity, etc., which teams are using these days to analyze the data. So it's always helpful to have those and to conduct focused or targeted keyword based searches on that data, because of course the digital data that you extract is going to be voluminous, and it's humanly impossible to go through all of that, and it doesn't make sense, right? You just need to find the relevant evidence which relates to your allegation. So I think that's the best way to progress with this. The next one, standard 430, is on loans or borrowings. I'm sure many of you will find, especially those of you who look at financial fraud engagements a lot, will find this very interesting. And I think, anyways, this is very interesting in the Indian scenario where, every second day we read about some scam or some fraud that occurs. So this actually sets out, what kind of disputes there are, what kind of checks we could do. So the standard talks about disputed transactions of loans or borrowings, right? So naturally, when there is a loan or borrowing which is disputed, there are a couple of things we want to look at, right? And of course, the overall objective is to see whether all the processes were complied with, all the laws, the statutory or regulatory provisions were complied with, right? And when you do the review or the investigation, you could find a an issue or a red flag at any point of that loan or borrowing transaction. So I think that is the key aspect, right? To understand where the issue or the red flag is it on the nature of the transaction itself, or is it in terms of how it was sanctioned, or is there a red flag in terms of how it was utilized? Most of the cases we see are where funds are granted as loans or borrowings, and then they are misutilized, right? Borrowers claim a certain purpose, but the end use is something else. So generally, when we do an asset trailing or a fund trailing exercise, that is when we are able to identify those kind of red flags and again corroborate the hypothesis, right? And the most common, I think, modus operandi which is used in so many of the big scams we have seen in India are, using either related parties or shell parties or connected parties, right? I mean, most of us know what related parties are. It's also defined in the Companies Act 2013. It could be, a common shareholder between two entities, a common director between two entities, investments, so many criteria, right? We all know also what a shell entity is in terms of, just an entity which is set up, which doesn't actually have any business operations or purpose, but, it's just incorporated sort of to route funds, from one source to the other. And, we know how the round tripping of funds is done, or evergreening of loans is done, and, how funds are misutilized in the end and defaulted in the end. I think that's the main, pain point that most Indian banks have, right? So the objective is that when an FAI professional is looking at such transactions, you need to also look at whether there's any nexus between the loan granting sanctioning authority and the borrower, right? Many a times we see that there is a conflict of interest. Because of that conflict of interest, even though the borrower does not have the capacity to avail a loan of that value, or they don't have the right amount appropriate collateral, but they are sanctioned the loan because of the conflict, and then it ends up in a default, right? So instead of waiting for a default or a misutilization to happen, just make sure that the end-to-end process is looked at thoroughly. And again, when we are investigating these kind of loans and borrowings, you need to look at multiple sources of evidence, right? You need to also corroborate multiple sources of evidence, because when you link different things, you might find a pattern or a trend emerging. So, people tend to look at the statutory payment documents, tax returns, credit rating reports, any of that, right? And whatever other digital footprint is there. So, that is, of course, the data you get from the books and accounts. People look at bank statements, like I said, to do fund tracing. But it often helps to also do integrity due diligence checks or market intelligence checks, right? Which would generally give you some information about the borrower, what kind of lifestyle they have, are there any previous records of default or not, or what is their loan exposure even through their related individuals or entities, and so on. So, some of that is very helpful. And again, depending on how complex the engagement is, the professional also may decide whether a use of, using the work of an expert would be necessary. So, if that's the case, you can always engage an expert for a part of the assignment, right? And I think these are kind of engagements which tend to be very broad in nature. So, professionals should always make sure that the scope is very clearly defined, right? Because you start with something and then you just have a host of data with you. So not to get lost in that, make sure that the scope is very well defined in terms of what is the objective and what is it that you're going to look at, right? So this slide basically sets out, like I said, some of the nature of disputes that you may find in relation to loans and borrowings, right? The second one is very interesting, one that I haven't covered already. There could be a collateral granted, but if the due checks are not performed on that collateral, then you might see that those assets are not even owned by the borrower, or they are not in existence, or they are already used as collateral for some other borrowing. That's possible as well. Or they might already be misappropriated by the borrower even before the default has taken place. Anything is possible, right? And like I said, falsified documents being submitted, defaults, we've covered all of that. So it's very important that in this specialized case, forensic accounting and investigation professionals are also well versed with the RBI rules, because this is something that RBI is definitely looking to plug, and they come out with various circulars and notifications. So please make sure that you're well aware of those, because then even what are the regulations that your client needs to be compliant with. Right. Moving on to, I think, the last two standards which I'm going to cover, and I think these would beautifully sort of culminate the entire journey of the FAI standards, which cover everything, right, from starting to planning the assignment to reporting and quality control. So I think 510 is very important. Reporting results, because if the results of the assignment or the engagement are not reported properly, then everything that is done, right, basis the earlier standards in terms of evidence gathered, work procedures performed, all the various procedures we saw for gathering evidence, all of that is in vain, right? So what is most important is that at the completion of the engagement, the FAI professional needs to issue a written report to the primary stakeholders, right? Primary stakeholders would of course be the ones who are engaging the professional, and those are the ones the report should be shared with as well. Suppose there is a scenario where you are asked to share it with certain other stakeholders, please make sure that you receive the requisite approvals, prior approvals for it, because the last thing you want is a confidential report which has names of targets, quantification of losses and damages, etc., going into the wrong hands, right? And some of these engagements we perform are for listed entities, and they have a lot to suffer if this kind of sensitive information comes out in the public domain. So always make sure confidentiality. One aspect of maintaining that is making sure the right people have access to the report. Make sure, if it's in a digital format, you can password protect it. If it's a physical report, then you make sure you hand it over to the right person, and so on, right? So it needs to be a written report, and there are certain key elements which every report has to have, and we'll cover that shortly on the next page. But what I said, which is most important, is that it needs to cover all the objectives, it needs to cover the scope of work, the procedures, if you had any limitations, if you were not able to perform any procedures, that needs to be put out, right? Like I said, one engagement may have multiple assignments, so you may decide to issue multiple reports as well if that's necessary, either because the subject matters are diverse, or you may have performed it in different phases, right? Very often we also issue interim reports or draft reports. It's not that straight away we issue a final report. So any report which is issued, whether interim or final, all of that needs to be well documented along with the supporting working papers, right? And to the extent possible, it should be precise and unambiguous. Like I mentioned, there might be certain rare scenarios where you may not be able to prove the hypothesis, but even then it should try and be precise to the best extent possible, or you could at least call out what evidence or documentation was not available, due to which you could not prove the hypothesis. That is generally helpful. So again, like I said, the standard is giving a lot of flexibility so that FAI professionals can apply their professional judgment. So it sets out the key elements, but there's no fixed form or structure to the report. But sometimes, yes, if your primary stakeholders have a format and they want you to give it in that, and that's defined in your engagement terms, then you may do so. Or let's say this is going to go to a competent authority or go for a legal or judicial scrutiny, then there might be a specific structure or format that you need to adhere to, right? And of course, all of you all must have also heard about the principle of natural justice. So there are some engagement mandates which also require that whatever findings the professional have are also discussed with the targets, right? Prior to finalization, because you need to give them a reasonable opportunity of being heard, of sharing their viewpoints with us. And a summary of whatever responses they provide should also be included in the report, right? So overall, the report is not expected to have any opinion or to pass any judgment on an individual, because it's believed that that is something more so which would happen in a court of law. But it should at least be a fact finding report which sets out the fact and circumstances, and what the professional set out to do in the first place. And it should be issued within reasonable timelines as defined and agreed in the engagement letter. Many a times there are unforeseen circumstances, there are data delays from clients, or generally because the data is not structured or voluminous or complex, it takes time to complete work procedures. So even if you see or anticipate a deviation from timelines, please make sure that you have that conversation with your client stakeholders and inform them about the same. Right. So what you see on this page are certain key elements of the report, right? We start with the title to the report, who is it addressed to, a distribution list, like I said, right? If many people are going to have access to it. Generally, we see that clients request that their auditors or advisors, legal advisors, or certain consultants may need to have access to the report. So in that case, if you have their names, mention them upfront, or later we sort of issue a consent letter to them. So it will go in obviously in a sequential chronological manner, where you will start with the scope, the objectives, the procedures. Most often we also tend to put out an executive summary if it's a very detailed report, so that the key stakeholders, if they just want to view the key aspects of the report at a glance, they can see that. So it's essential that an executive summary is well drafted and captures the essence of your review and the report, right? And in specialized scenarios where you may have used an expert, then we need to make reference to the expert who is used and some of the key steps performed in terms of ensuring their independence, objectivity, what was the scope which was assigned to them. And sometimes the experts report is also attached to the main report, or you might include an extract, right? That is again left to the professional judgment of the professional. Right. Most important point number F, right? Stating, or more than stating, ensuring that the assignment has been conducted in accordance with the forensic accounting and investigation standards, right? Because like we have established, these standards are just the beginning focal point, right? I mean, as the ICI community of members get well acquainted with it, your clients get well acquainted with it, the aim or the target is to have it notified by law, right? So adhering to them is going to be really important. And if there are any material departures from it, right, either intentional or unintentional, those need to be called out in the report, right? Proactively, rather than somebody reviewing and finding deviations or non-compliances with the standards, right? What we generally tend to also include are, like I said, the sources of the evidence, the key evidence relied upon. Sometimes we add exhibits, appendices to the report. That's usually very helpful. The conclusions, like I said, if any, drawn, and any disclaimers, right, that you may want the reader of the report to know, as to what is the context under which this engagement has been performed and things like that, so that it's not misinterpreted by anybody. All right, coming to the last standard, which is number 610, which talks about quality control, right? So like we covered, review and supervision, and it's related to that, even quality control is an ongoing process, right? It does not happen one time at the end or the completion of the assignment. It needs to happen, in a smooth manner throughout the course of the assignment, right? So again, the nature and extent of quality control, how it will be done, whether a QCS, a quality control system, will be established, is up to the professional. But quality control definitely needs to be there, however small or large the assignment is, right? And especially considering that FAI assignments have multiple stakeholders, right? I mean, you could be interacting with the client's finance or accounting spoke, the legal, HR, ethics, operations team, so many stakeholders, right? So recognizing each of their quality expectations and adhering to that is important. Same way, like I said, these standards are governed by ICI and DAB, or tomorrow you may testify before a competent authority. So all the quality expectations of all these diverse stakeholders need to be kept in mind, right? And of course, like I said, the main aim of these standards is to ensure that we are delivering quality output, right? Which is going through a disciplined, streamlined, structured, systematic approach, right? So, of course, you have the right people, the right processes, and if you have a quality control system, then you can be rest assured that you're complying with all of this, right? So, like I said, you would have quality control before the assignment starts in terms of the resource allocation, whether they're skilled, involving an expert, what tools and technologies during the process as well, to see if the work procedures are going as planned. Are there any roadblocks or gaps that are there which come to light, and post completion, right? Post completion is very important, because before you issue the report to the client, right, that's when quality control has utmost significance, because you want to be sure that the report you're releasing is factually accurate, right? So many a times we even opt for peer reviews or peer quality reviews or external reviews. So any of that is fine as long as the due quality review has been performed, right? So, and it's necessary that the requirements or the expectations of the QCS are notified well in advance, right? So, the expectation from FAI professionals is that a quality control system is established. So, all your employees need to be aware already that such a QCS exists. So, quality will be monitored, certain checks will be conducted, right? So, if they are aware of the QCS policy, then they will ensure that the work they are also performing is timely and in line with that, right? And another important aspect of the standard is, a regular monitoring of the CPR requirements as well, right? So many times we receive emailers, and of course, even for this session, you all will get CPRs, right? So monitoring that as well specifically is very important. Right. Perfect. I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. I've been mindful and finished a bit in advance. In case we have any questions, happy to take those, Akanksha.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. We do not have any questions as such. We just have a thank you message for one of our members for such an informational session.
Okay, that's great. I hope, the session was pretty clear, and I hope everyone's read the standards. So that addresses no questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I thank all the participants for being a part of our insightful webinar on overview of forensic accounting and investigation standards. A special thanks to our distinguished speakers for sharing their expertise with all of us. We look forward to more such engaging sessions in the future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.